Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're gonna glide very gently into a topic that is both awkward and oddly soothing if you think about it too long. What people in the ancient world used before toilet paper existed. Yes, this entire episode will be about history's least glamorous hygiene solutions. So if you're already tucked in and ready to drift off, don't worry. Nothing here is too exciting. In fact, most of it is mildly depressing. Perfect bedtime material. Now let's set the scene. Toilet paper, as we know it today, is shockingly recent. The Chinese were the first to produce something recognizable as toilet paper in the 6th century AD. But for most of human history, people were out there improvising with, well, whatever was nearby, which, if you picture it, wasn't exactly charming. Let's float first to ancient Greece, a civilization that gave us philosophy, geometry, democracy, and for bathroom needs, they used stones. Smooth pebbles, to be exact. Imagine Socrates sitting around asking deep questions about truth and justice, and then going home to scrape himself with a rock. The Greeks even had a word for it, pessoi. These were little rounded pebbles kept near the latrine. Sometimes they also used fragments of broken pottery called ostraca, which, coincidentally, were the same shards they used to write down the names of people they wanted to exile from the city. So yes, there's a decent chance that someone's least favorite politician literally ended up being, well, rubbed in places you don't want to think about. The Romans, of course, saw what the Greeks were doing and said, "We can make this grosser." Enter the famous communal sponge on a stick, or as historians politely call it, the tersorium. This wasn't an individual item. It was shared. Imagine walking into a grand Roman public toilet, marble seats lined up side by side with no dividers, because privacy was apparently for cowards. And at the end of the row, you've got one sponge, stuck on the end of a wooden stick, soaking in a bucket of salty water or vinegar. That was the community wipe. Use it, rinse it, put it back for the next guy. The Roman Empire may have had aqueducts and gladiators, but when it came to sanitation, things got real cozy. Now if you're thinking, surely royalty had something better, the answer is, not really. Wealthier Romans sometimes used soft wool or rose petals if they were feeling decadent. But the average citizen, and honestly a lot of elites too, relied on that same sad sponge. There's even a story of a Roman soldier who committed suicide by swallowing one, which honestly might be the single worst sentence in the history of the Latin language. Meanwhile, let's drift eastward to China, where things were a little more civilized. The first recorded mention of paper being used for bathroom purposes comes from around the 6th century. A court official politely remarked that it would be inappropriate to use certain fancy papers, like ones inscribed with sacred texts, for what he diplomatically called hygienic purposes. By the 14th century, during the Ming Dynasty, they were actually mass-producing large sheets of toilet paper specifically for the imperial court. Imagine being the poor factory worker who had to stack those rolls. Not exactly as noble as building the Great Wall. In Japan, things got even stranger. Early on, people used a tool called a chugi, basically a flat wooden stick like a spatula. They weren't just wiping the outside either. Sometimes these sticks were used internally. And yes, that's as uncomfortable as it sounds. If you ever needed more proof that history was not glamorous, there it is. But we don't want to leave anyone out. In medieval Europe, things were more rustic. People used hay, straw, moss, or whatever plant matter was nearby. In coastal areas, mussel shells sometimes did the job. Wealthier households might have linen scraps, but even that was rare. It wasn't until centuries later that anything resembling modern toilet paper became common. For most of the Middle Ages, people were essentially rolling the dice between a handful of hay or a cold river wash. Neither option screams luxury. And let's not forget the Vikings. They were known to use leftover sheep's wool, which is actually one of the better historical options. Still, it feels ironic that the same people who terrorized Europe and crossed the seas in dragon-headed ships were ultimately humbled by the simple need to wipe with wool scraps. So, from pebbles to sponges to sticks and hay, humanity has had a long history of being mildly uncomfortable in the bathroom. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't glamorous. And honestly, it makes modern toilet paper feel like the pinnacle of civilization. Let's keep drifting, because if there's one thing history never runs out of, it's more awkward details about sanitation. In ancient India, things leaned more toward water than wiping. Long before modern bidets became a thing in Europe, Indian texts and customs emphasized washing with water after using the toilet. It was practical, hygienic, and, frankly, way less unpleasant than pottery shards. But it also meant a culture-wide aversion to the idea of dry wiping, which, if you think about it, was probably the smartest choice anyone made in this entire story. Over in the Islamic world, much the same system developed. Ritual cleanliness was, and still is, an important part of daily life, so water was the preferred method. That's why, to this day, so many bathrooms in Muslim-majority countries have little handheld hoses or water jugs nearby. It's one of those traditions that actually made a lot of sense and stood the test of time. But Europe was stubborn. They kept fiddling around with rags and straw. And this is where things get kind of ironic. Monarchs who lived in castles with dozens of servants, piles of gold, and banquet tables groaning with roasted swans were still crouching over drafty garderobes and wiping with moss. Imagine a French king in jewel-encrusted robes. Then picture him later in the evening using a handful of damp grass. Suddenly, the whole majesty thing loses a little shine. By the Renaissance, the wealthy had slightly upgraded. Some royals used cloth, which was washed and reused by servants. Yes, you heard that right, washed and reused. And if you're wondering who got that delightful chore, it was usually the lowest-ranking scullery staff. Being born into palace service didn't always mean polishing silver and attending fancy banquets. Sometimes it meant scrubbing things you really didn't want to scrub. Now, the big turning point for toilet paper, at least in the Western world, doesn't come until the 19th century. In 1857, a man named Joseph Gaiety in New York started selling packs of medicated paper sheets. He advertised them as a health product impregnated with aloe, which supposedly prevented hemorrhoids. The downside? They were basically just loose sheets in a box, not very convenient. And honestly, most people weren't rushing to spend money on something they'd been solving with corn cobs or old newspapers for free. Yes, you heard that right, corn cobs. On American farms, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, dried corn cobs were a common toilet aid. They were cheap, plentiful, and, well, let's just say they had the right texture. Once mass-produced paper became more widespread, farmers often used pages from old catalogs, especially the Sears Roebuck catalog. Tear out a page, crumple it up, and congratulations, you had yourself a rustic version of Charmin. The Sears company even had to start printing their catalogs on glossy paper later, which apparently annoyed a lot of customers who had been depending on the pages for more than just shopping. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Scott Paper Company started producing rolls of toilet paper in the 1870s. But here's the funny part. At first, nobody wanted to admit they were buying it. Stores often kept it under the counter, sold in plain packaging, so customers could discreetly ask for it without dying of embarrassment. Because apparently, admitting you wiped it all was too scandalous for polite Victorian society. It wasn't until the early 20th century that toilet paper really took off. By the 1920s and 30s, manufacturers like Charmin started marketing it as a luxurious, soft product. They even used cute babies in their ads to make the whole thing feel less awkward. And from there, the industry boomed. But if we zoom out and look at the big picture, most of human history didn't have toilet paper. For thousands of years, people made do with stones, shells, sticks, moss, wool, and corn cobs. It's not exactly the stuff of romantic nostalgia. Nobody looks back and says, "Ah, the good old days of wiping with pottery shards." And yet, this unglamorous little detail tells us a lot about daily life, about how people adapted with whatever was around them, about how royalty wasn't always as glamorous as the portraits suggest, and about how sometimes civilization really is measured by the small comforts. Aqueducts are nice, castles are nice, but let's be honest, most of us would rather have toilet paper. So next time you're in the bathroom, staring at a soft, perforated roll, you can take a quiet moment to thank Joseph Gaiety, the Scott brothers, and basically everyone who pushed humanity past the stone and sponge stage. Progress isn't always about battles and inventions. Sometimes it's just about finding a better way to get clean. And with that, let's slowly fade out. Because the world may be full of strange histories, but nothing is quite as humbling, or as quietly funny, as the long, awkward story of how people cleaned themselves. Good night.